Another important development culturally was the development of religion. I already spoke to this a little bit when talking about elemental gods, but I haven't yet really told you the foundation, right, of the Near Eastern system. And that is the idea of polytheism, right? The expansion and the creation of polytheism. Now, what is polytheism? Theism, or to be theistic, right, is to celebrate the gods, right, or worship the gods, or have a belief system in the gods. Poly means many. So polytheism is a many godded system. You're probably more familiar with monotheism, a one godded system. But early religions were always pretty much polytheism, right? You run into Zoroastrianism, of course, Judaism. But if you look at the majority of early religions, right, they are polytheistic in nature. And why? They were polytheists because they believed you needed many gods to do many jobs. It's the easiest way to put it. The idea of one god who could do everything, they were like, that's nuts. One god can't deal with the sun and the moon and the tides and the water and the no. So they thought that, again, you needed a god for each task in a sense. And to have only one god made no sense to them. This is why, if you look at the persecution of Jews, in early Western civilization, why did they persecute Jews? Well, they thought they were crazy because they were one God people. So they were like, you got one God, that's just nutty. So this idea of, and we'll talk about also like Akhenaten in Egypt, who tries to create a monotheism in Egypt, and they're like, you're insane. We're going to kill you, right? So, to them, to these people, polytheism was the only thing that made sense. So it shows you how quickly things can change, right? Based on the beliefs, right, of a people during that time. Now, the polytheism of this time usually was relevant also to another system, which was the city state system. Now, you can go back and look at that map I showed you, and you can see that there's different cities kind of sprinkled right through the Mesopotamian area. Cities like Ur and Uruk, right? Babylon. And, the way I try to describe it is they're all Mesopotamians, right? But they usually have their loyalty to their city state. So they thought on smaller terms. The best way I can describe this, I think, is to think of Florida. It is a very, very big state with a lot of people in it. And I would argue that we're not a lot of likes sometimes, right? We have a lot of differences. And so if you think of Florida, we're all Floridians, but we usually kind of more so give our loyalty to a certain area or a certain place. I use the example of sports. So FSU, Seminoles. That would be our city state, right? And our city state god in a sense. And we have a rival city state, right? We have the Gators down in Gainesville. So I often say, if you think about city states, you can think about it as almost like the idea of city states and their gods as being equitable to, sports teams and their mascots. And if you think about the way that people go to sporting events, right, it almost has a religious fervor to it. There's chanting, right? There's celebration. There's definitely worship involved. So I try to use that analogy because I think it maybe can hit home with my students, and they can have a reference point to that. So each city state is going to have their god or their goddess, right? And they're going to focus their attention on that god or goddess, but they're not going to be ignorant of the other gods and goddesses. They're going to understand that all these other gods and goddesses exist, but they're going to have a primary sort of focus of their worship on that one specific god or goddess. How do they worship? They build temples, or what Mesopotamians called ziggurats. So in class, it is important to understand certain terms. Learning the terminology is essential to being a content master. So ziggurat is the formal term we use for a Mesopotamian temple. And these are built out of mud brick because, as I'll stress as we go along in our discussion, stone was a very scarce resource in this region. So I often refer to these people as stone poor. They are stone poor in their culture. So if you see something made out of stone in this culture, it means it probably was very important. So they use mud brick because it's a local material. It's something they can, make very cheaply. It's very available to them. I also think in this climate, it makes a lot of sense because of the yearly flooding. Notice as they build the temples with this mud brick, they make them in layers, almost terraced layers kind of going up. We also think that was because of the floods. So every year when it flooded, your main temple was way up on the apex or the top. So you're not going to have any problems with anything being wiped out. You might have to do some minor reconstruction on the bottom, but no big problem there. So we think that this was a very functional way of building. We also think it's symbolic. As you build your temples up to the gods, in a sense, you're creating a conduit or a connection to the gods. You're creating this idea of a connection upward to them, where you're reaching up to the gods and connecting to them. So there's a lot that can be said for the type of construction of the ziggurat being very symbolic, right, to how they want to try to access their gods and worship their gods also. And most ziggurats today, unfortunately, are in pretty bad shape. This is the ziggurat at Ur, which has been partially reconstructed. So it gives you a sense of what these ziggurats would have looked like, at least on the main platform area, with the kind of the staircase going up. One thing I also wanted to mention as uh, commoners, common people, they would not have had access, right, to the ziggurat temple. They would have not gone up to the ziggurat and gone to the area where the gods were worshipped. So not to the pinnacle, right, up the top of that temple. What they would have done is they would have brought offerings to the gods. The priest or the priestess, and how to remember this is, priests, they were with male gods, priestesses are with female gods. So there was sort of gender separation in this polytheistic practice. What you would do is you would bring these offerings to the priest or the priestess, and they would dedicate them for you. So they would take them to the top of the temple and give them as your offering, essentially. So, one thing I always try to make sure you're very clear about with these early religions is they're what I call exclusive. So, if you could see me, I'm kind of pushing my hand out, like, get out, right? We're used to more inclusive religions. So, my hands are coming in, like, come in. I want to give you a hug, right? So there really are two primary sort of setups for religion. There's exclusive, stay out, inclusive, come in. Earlier religions tend to be extremely exclusive. They tend to say, yeah, we got a priest or a priestess for that. We don't really need you in here doing anything. Please don't come in the temple. Thanks a lot, go away. So there wasn't a lot of active participation in a lot of these religions. It was really about the faith you had in the gods and giving offerings and such. But there wasn't a lot of like, hey, I have to do something or I have to go somewhere on Sunday or Friday or Saturday, no. You gave your offerings and that was that. Again, later religions like Christianity, Islam, they're going to speak more to an inclusivity. You have to read a sacred text, you have to do prayers, you have to go to church or temple or mosque, you have to do these things. So again, when we get later into the course, I'll stress the shift that happens and why we think it happens at that time. You'll notice that these are little figures, right? We call these prayer figures because they look like they're praying. In prayerful gesture, the hands clasped is a classic. You see different variations in it, over the years, but this is what we call the prayerful gesture. And so we call them prayer figures. Now, prayer figures, there were a lot of them made. These are the particular group we call the Tel Asmar figures. So I tell my students there will be an umbrella of objects like prayer figures. There are a lot of them. These are specific within that umbrella. They are the Tel Asmar figures. So again, this is how titling, using your titles for objects, helps you out because you Google Tel Asmar figures, you're going to find this particular group. Google prayer figures, you're going to get a lot of stuff. So they fall within the umbrella of a larger production, might we say. And I'd mentioned before that artists probably didn't really think of themselves, as creators in that individualistic sense, like we might today. They probably thought of themselves more as artisans or producers of something. These are a good example of that idea because making prayer figures, yes, you had to be talented, you had to know how to sculpt them and paint them and all these kind of things that are very much about your technique. But at the same time, I don't think these people sat around going like, I'm an artist. They were like, I make something that, my community uses. I'm an artisan. I'm a craftsperson. This is my job. This is what I do. There's more probably a sense of production behind it and satisfaction of community need than self-expression, if you get the point there. So again, our reasons for making art today and their reasons for making art, very, very different, right, from one another. So the artisans would produce these things and then people would purchase them. We think that's maybe why they were different sizes. Maybe it had something to do with status and your purchasing ability, because these early cultures were usually hierarchies with very few people on the top and a lot of people on the bottom. So there was a sense of hierarchy of, status. So maybe that's why they're different sizes. Maybe it's to symbolize people growing up or growing older. Who knows? We don't really know. But we do know what you did was purchase these things and then you would take them to your priest and priestess and they would dedicate them for you. I think really what they were supposed to do is be your stand in, be your substitute, because you can't pray 24/7. So the sculpture did it for you. The sculpture, in a sense, became the thing that was always wide eyed and worshipful. Because look at them, right? These big wide eyes, always connected to the gods, always praying, always there, right? To meet the needs that the gods demanded, while you could go around and do your everyday activities.